sermon podcast for Sunday, the 30th of April 2023, the fourth Sunday of Easter. Readings Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47. The first letter of Peter, chapter 2, verses 19 to 25. And the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verses 1 to 10. If any parish priest tells you that she or he isn't interested in and doesn't play the numbers game, then they probably won't be telling the truth. By numbers game, I mean the week-by-week count of heads, bums on seats, the anxious and sometimes obsessive scanning of a congregation, spotting eagerly new faces, noting forlornly familiar absences. I played that game when I was parish priest of Tilbury. No matter how unhelpful and absurd I tried to convince myself it was, it seemed I was wedded to, shackled to the weekly count, particularly when it was all the easier to spot absences and gaps in a fairly small congregation. Why had so-and-so been missing for a month? Had I said or done something wrong? Why hadn't that new family, which had seemed so promising, not turned up? And so on. The inexplicable sparseness of the congregation on one Sunday was matched only by the puzzling abundance of it on another, and there seemed to be no rhyme or reason for it. Well, with the deepening financial crisis of the Church of England and the ever-increasing financial burden on parishes to pay spiralling family purses, it is a game likely to be ever more prevalent and obsessive. Despite all our frequent protestations to the contrary, we are always tempted to fall back on the simple equation that a healthy and growing congregation means the promise of greater financial security. It's human nature to seek safety in numbers. But a full church is also a disarmingly comfortable way of interpreting what Christ described as Christians having life and having it abundantly in this morning's gospel. Having gone through the door of the sheepfold, having made the right choice and obeyed the right voice, there is rich pasture among like-minded people, isn't there? There is safety and security in knowing they are away from the wolf and the hireling, assured of their well-being and growth under the watchful eye of the shepherd. We could be forgiven for thinking perhaps that Luke, in his description of the activities of the earliest church in today's reading from the Acts of the Apostles, is indulging himself in a little triumphant reverie. We know, merely from a few verses later, that trouble was soon to come. But Luke describes a honeymoon period when all seemed to be fellowship and harmony and charity, a common devotion whilst surrounded by increasing numbers to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. Many scholars think this verse from Acts is an ancient creedal formula that described the activity of the earliest church. But one of the reasons why it reaches into our hearts and into the heart of the church today is that it represents the utopian dream that is at the end of all our counting. A happy, thriving church bursting at the seams and rather cosseted from the world outside. Even a cursory glance at what is often referred to as a postmodern world today, though, leaves many people wondering if a sign of a healthy, growing church presented to us in Acts 2 has any relevance or point anyway. Christendom seems to be buried beneath the rubble of its own failure. When we observe the secularization of religion in the last 150 years or so, we notice that it is the historic churches and the mainstream denominations of Europe and the United States that have declined. Establishment churches no longer speak for the culture or even for the establishment, except perhaps for those grand state occasions. Even Christian parents know that the chances of socializing their children into the sheepfold are slim, because as soon as they set foot outside their front door, they are entering a pluralistic world of what Andrew Walker, in his book called Telling the Story, calls 1,000 siren voices. Even when they are indoors watching television in their rooms, he says, they hear the same voices, but this time in stereo and accompanied by seductive imagery. And yet I believe that this image of growth and security, the sheep within the sheepfold, presented to us by Luke in this reading from Acts today and in the Gospel, is important because of our postmodern situation and not in spite of it. It's an image which, if it jars our modern sensibilities, it should also awaken and alert them. And the reason for this is that the image of the earliest Christians devoting themselves to teaching and fellowship and the breaking of bread and the prayers contains within it two vital ingredients for renewed mission to a world desperate for renewal. What are they? They are liturgy and they are community. Praying and breaking bread might seem a simple enough liturgy, but still to do it in today's world is not to abandon imagery and drama to a postmodern culture, but it is to reclaim it for ourselves and offer it back to God. In a world where icons proliferate but are profane, where texts swarm everywhere but have lost their sting, where young people who have been weaned on the electronic image and have grown accustomed to alternative lifestyles, liturgy can be a beacon to show the way out. We may have to constantly consider our packaging and presentation of liturgy, and indeed to meditate constantly on its relevance. But we must never stop doing it in one form or another, because what else is there to enable people to discover transcendence and otherness, a reference point beyond themselves? Listening to the apostles' teaching in fellowship, one with another, might seem a simple enough activity, but it contains a powerful message to a postmodern world. Liturgy, however beautiful and transparent it may be, is not enough. Christianity also needs holy communities to live as well as tell the Christian story. In a world where so many no longer live in community, where global wars and want have destroyed community for so many, as surely as electronic cyberspace ensures the isolation and individualism of so many others, local congregations and communities of Christians, even though they are now more voluntary associations rather than natural communities, can still demonstrate something of the connectedness of creation and the fact that we all belong to one another. And our fellowship, one with another, is perhaps the most crucial thing of all. For if we are backbiting, arrogant, triumphalist, and Pharisaic communities, we become merely a mirror image of the larger culture. The world will turn back on itself, none the wiser for meeting us. Ultimately, says Andrew Walker, if we cannot demonstrate the proof of our story by living it, we will never convince people of its truth by talking about it. None of this has anything to do with making ourselves feel satisfied or paranoid by how full our churches are because of our conduct and worship inside them, or by feeling secure, enclosed by the sheepfold that seems to have pulled up the drawbridge on the world. Teaching, fellowship, the breaking of bread, and the prayers has nothing to do with how we increase our numbers, but it has everything to do with how we conduct mission to the world and make real and live the gospel to those who are outside the sheepfold. We have to become missionaries to our own culture, but the weapons for that fight have already been given to us. In fact, they've been there from the beginning.